Big power game on the high seas. Great powers have great navies. India has started to realize this. Prime Minister Narendra Modi will on Wednesday at the naval dockyards in Mumbai commission into the Indian Navy the guided missile destroyer Surat, stealth frigate Nilgiri, and diesel electric submarine Wakshir. Stealth frigate Nilgiri and diesel electric submarine Wakshir, together worth 30,000 crore, will less weapon cost. There is also very high likelihood that Committee of Security, led by him, could sign off this month on the acquisition of 26 Rafale Marine Strike Fighters for aircraft carriers INS Vikrant and three additional Scorpion class submarines from France. The two deals are currently being vetted by the Finance Ministry and should be on the CCS table later this month. The two acquisitions have been in the works for some time and have nothing to do with Modi's visit to France next month, but they are linked to a threat posed by People's Liberation Army. There has been a lot of attention to the threat India faces and its land borders in the north and the west, but the government and the Indian Navy are equally alert to the threat from the Indo-Pacific, where the plan has been to has been expanding rapidly in the past decade, especially in the Indian Ocean region. For instance, at this moment there are 9 PLA warships, 9 quasi-military ships, including ballistic missiles, satellite tracking, and surveillance ones, an oil tanker, and an over 150 high-value fishing vessels, all from China, in Indian Ocean region from Australia to eastern seaboard of Africa. Since 2020, Plan's development has been rapidly increased in IOR. It was 6 units in 2019, 13 in 2020, 15 in 2021, 2022 and 2023. People's Liberation Army Navy. On average, there are no less than 6 to 7 planned ships in Indian Ocean region at any point of time. It's hard to ignore the fact that for the first time in its history, China has a defense minister from plan. Doing Dong Jun, a former Eastern Fleet commander for the past 2 years, Plan has believed People Liberation Army Navy is believed to have cornered the major stake in China's defense budget, according to international agency and tracking that track military spending. China already has the biggest navy in the world with a total of 500 combatants, including 355 major warships. One statistic highlights that threat better than most. China has added the equivalent of the Indian Navy's entire fleet strength to plan in the past decade. It has now bases in Djibouti, Gwadar in West Asia, Sihanouk Vikle in Cambodia, apart from having logistic support base in Hambantota in Sri Lanka. This month, United States Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the first women officer to hold the rank, unveiled a document stating that China has plans to capture Taiwan in 2027. This is not the first time the US has said this. The same was communicated by US Pacific Fleet commander to his Indian counterpart during Quad naval exercises in 2023. The threat is clear. Beijing's cartographical dominance of the South China Sea and plans rapidly expanding footprint in the Indo-Pacific is of concern to Quad powers, particularly India. China has great power ambitions and the warship manufacturing capacity to fuel its war plans for the future. Given the vulnerability of sea lanes and Chinese presence over ingress routes to the critical South China Sea, India has no option but to be prepared for future friction with plan as the latter expands into IOR with carrier patrols expected as early as end 2025. Some of India's top national security planners believe that PLA aggression in East Ladakh and all along the 3,400 line of actual control in May 2020 was calculated subterfuge to divert the Indian and Quad attention from plans moves in IOR. Under the current scenarios, the Modi government has to ensure that India's naval capacity has increased dramatically to meet the Chinese challenge that could come directly or through client states such as Pakistan in coming decade. The Indian Navy warship strength is around 135 and the government has taken steps to strengthen Indian deterrence on land, sea and air with strategic platforms. India has begun work on the construction of two nuclear powers conventionally armed submarines (SSNs) and significant progress has been made on the nuclear power ballistic submarines (SSBNs) with the launch of INS Arisudan, the last of the Arihant class last year. SSBNs Arihant and Arighat are already patrolling the deep with INS Aridaman scheduled to be commissioned this year. While the Defense Ministry accepted that Navy's plans to construct 7 more heavy destroyers at the cost of 70,000 crore last year, India also needs to keep its warship and submarine manufacturing ticking as it takes nearly a decade from government approval to commissioning. The 30-year-old submarine construction plan of which INS Vaxir is a part of was approved by Vajpayee government more than a quarter of a century ago. India has India not only has to enhance its warship capacities but also look at future technologies in the maritime domain with underwater drones and armed UAVs dominating the maritime security discourse. With China today operating 3 aircraft carriers, India must also take an early decision in the replacement of aging INS Vikramaditya, which will become a relic in the coming years. Similarly, a decision will also be required on the Indian Navy's Project 75I for 6 additional submarines equipped with air independent propulsion. The past centuries have shown that great global powers have great navies. India will take a huge step in this direction at Mumbai on Wednesday, but one more needs to be done. Worry about a falling rupee. A strong currency is no reflection of a strong economy. Exchange rates are best left to economists to manage. It is widely and popularly believed that strong currency is a reflection of a strong economy. This belief explains why there is a lot of hue and cry when countries' currency is depreciating sharply. Much like the rupee is right now, this is neither the first time nor the last time such a frenzy is being whipped up. It is almost poetic justice that politicians who once used the exchange rate as political weapon are going red in the face trying hard to discredit its use by the opponents. To be sure they are right, an exchange rate should not be a matter of national pride, but politics aside, the actual economics of what drives exchange rate is paradoxically simple and complicated at the same time. Exchange rates, like any other price, are determined by demand and supply in the market. If foreign investors or importers want to invest or import from India, they would have to buy rupees in exchange for dollars. If foreign investors or importers want to invest or import from India, they would have to buy rupees in exchange for dollars. An increasing demand for rupees, ceteris paribus, will push up its value vis-a-vis the dollar. If the foreign capital wants to pull out of India or Indian imports from the rest of the world, Indian imports from the rest of the world increase, we will need to buy more dollars in return for rupees, leading to fall of the Indian rupee. This simple reasoning must navigate a lot of complicated trading and algorithms of private players as well as central banks in the real world. What is most driving down the rupee's value right now is strengthening of the dollar as expectations of more interest rate cuts by the Federal Reserve diminish. With better returns in US, it is natural for hot money to flow back to the dominant currency market, While the Reserve Bank of India has deployed some of its forex reserves to manage the exchange rate, it would have been foolish to try and keep it unchanged. Does this make the ongoing volatility in forex markets a trivial affair? Not at all. This has a significant trade off in terms of deployment of economic policy tools, including interest rates, liquidity, and trade competitiveness. A weaker currency helps exports but also raises the import bill. This is exactly what economists, both in governments and markets, are likely thinking about at the moment. And while the modern economies and its practitioners are a much berated lot, some of the criticism is well deserved. This is likely one instance where economics is best left to economists. Economics is best left to economists. This has significant trade-off in terms of deployment of economic policy tools, including interest rate, liquidity, and trade competitiveness. A weaker currency helps exports but also raises the import bill. When establishment memorializes Orwell to mark the 75th death anniversary of George Orwell, Mint released the Royal Mint released £2 coin on Tuesday. The coin commemorates Orwell's celebrated dystopian novel 1984. Orwell was the child of the empire. He was born in Motihari in 1903 and spent his first 4 years in India. His childhood was mostly spent in private boarding schools in Imperial Britain, and after completing school, he joined the Indian Imperial Police and served in Burma, then part of India for 5 years. He returned to Britain in his late 20s to become a writer. Niti Aayog 2.0 in the time of global churn. Yamini Iyer. Intellectual traditions of the neoliberal era, open markets, deregulation, globalization, smaller state that dominated policy making in India since 1991 movement are losing legitimacy both in India and across the world. With rise of populism, the Western turn to deglobalization, rapid technological advancement, and accelerating climate crisis, the globe has now entered a new turbulent era. Closer to home, the grim realities of our economic trajectory, a stalled structural transformation, persistent unemployment, and growing inequality are adding to the turbulence. With accepted pathways in contention, the scale of the predicament confronting policy making is unprecedented. Now more than ever, the craft of policy making needs to be embedded in ideas and evidence, transparent and democratic dialogue across stakeholders, particularly at the state level, and a culture that welcomes active public contestation and an openness to critique. This is the backdrop against which the performance of government's think tank, the Niti Aayog, which turned 10 this January, ought to be debated. The January 2015 cabinet resolution mandating its formation was unusually prescient. It is argued that government needed a directional and policy dynamo that would provide a shared vision of national development and respond to the changing and integrated world. Yet Niti Aayog's performance in these 10 years has been underwhelming, stymied by the combination of contextual and structural factors. Consider first the political context. Despite cabinet resolutions, frequent invocation of research and knowledge system, the reality is that Niti Aayog emerged in a political culture that is impatient with critique. For policy making, this has meant that credible independent research and ideas are increasingly scant. Consider the MG Narega scheme. Its 2006 launch onwards, the scheme has been studied by researchers of all hues, creating a vibrant evidence base on what works, what doesn't, and why. The government accepted what it liked and ignored what it didn't, and the public debated key ideas. Today, you will be hard pressed to find wide ranging evidence on government schemes. Those that get published usually tell good stories, and inconvenient data is actively legitimized. This is also the fate of critical sources of government data. How can a think tank perform its function of offering knowledge-based policy advice when thinking itself is being weaponized? Unsurprisingly, therefore, Niti Aayog has leaned on the private sector and management consultants, drafting them into the government far more than academics, technical experts, and civil society. Partly as a consequence, Niti Aayog's strategic visioning exercises have been underwhelming. A vision for India at 75 and 3-year action agenda, inviting limited public consultation and having limited policy influence. But even if political contexts were different, Niti Aayog's capacity for generative thinking, strategic visioning with the state, and policy influence is constrained, ironically, by the logic of its own creation. By 2015, the Planning Commission has reduced itself to a functioning as an outdated tool of centralization that used its budgetary powers to approve state development plans to advance the union government's agenda. Stripping the Commission's successor of budgetary powers and eliminating the plan non plan distinction in public expenditure was a logical step in forward, one that technocrats had long argued for. But it created new problems. Without budgetary powers, the Niti Aayog positions within the power hierarchy of policy making has remained ambiguous. Crucially, there emerged an institutional vacuum. A significant percentage of fiscal transfer to states, particularly pertaining to development, falls outside the remit of Finance Commission. In the days of the Planning Commission, these were the part of plan negotiations with states, but with its dismantling, an institutional vacuum emerged. Line ministries and finance ministry, who has taken over this function, neither is equipped for this role, and they do not have institutionalized mechanism for center-state bargaining. Consequently, the states have been further disempowered, and the Niti Aayog's creation has added to growing frictions in the center-state relations. Without budgetary powers, the Niti Aayog sought a place in the power hierarchy of policy making that its indices and ranking performance of states and aspirational districts programs directed at promoting competitive federalism. This left it susceptible to criticism that it lacks the autonomy needed to be a credible think tank for Team India and instead serves as a vehicle for centralization, promoting policy priorities relevant to the union government. The, the charge has struck because strategic planning or visioning initiated by the Niti Aayog now, with its state level counterparts, lacks teeth. Back in 2019, Kelkar and other veteran policymakers batted for restructured Niti Aayog, empowered with financial muscle, devoted to devising coherent medium and long-term strategies. Kelkar was focused on interstate imbalances. Others argued that 21st century vision of industrial policy rather than sporadic infusions like PILs, which make a comeback in the age of uncertainty. But no restructuring will work if political culture mitigates against two conditions: open inquiry and federalism, necessary for a Niti Aayog like body to fulfill its mandate. Impending slowdown in China US technosphere. Showdown. The year 2025 has begun on a bad note for Chinese tech companies, with the US designating social media and gaming giant Tencent and battery manufacturer company Amperex Technologies as military companies. Tencent interests span the spheres of finance, cloud computing, media, messaging, video streaming, and movie production. Unlike American law, a list of entities that may be aiding or furthering the Communist CCP's military civil fusion strategy, which aims to leverage private firms in improving technologies that have defense application, must be maintained. With this development, the US China technology contest is heating up ahead of the inauguration of Donald Trump as president. Significantly, Trump's first saw technology restrictions imposed on Chinese majors like Huawei and ZTE. The Trump has been taken on Trump had taken on Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, Bad Trinity in the Chinese technosphere. He promoted that Clean Cloud initiative that sought to build public opinion against cloud storage services of the Bad Trinity that were trying to expand in American market. US government also moved to counter Beijing's influence in submarine internet cables. In December 24, Biden administration brought technology controls in semiconductors, adding new Chinese entities to trade adding new Chinese entities to a trade blacklist. The new regulations cover not only Chinese semiconductor manufacturers but also all supporting systems of chip making equipment. Additionally, there has been crackdown on the export of memory chips used in artificial intelligence applications. The rules covers items produced overseas with the help of US technology. Private equity firms have put money into developing China's technology sector have been included in the blacklist. Beijing has hit back with tit for tat measures. Recently, China's Ministry of Commerce announced its intention to curb export of know-how related to the production of lithium-ion batteries, which is key to global push for electric automobiles. It also aims to add extraction technology for gallium, important for semiconductor production, to the restricted export list. Days after Trump's electoral win, Beijing imposed export curbs on critical items like tungsten, graphene, magnesium, aluminum alloys, classifying them as dual use. Apart from their use in technology and supply chain, they also have applications in building military equipment. Tencent, Tencent and CATL do not run the risk of triggering sanctions immediately, but designation as companies with ties to People Liberation Army will have reputational consequences, as seen from the stock prices of both taking a hit. It may affect plans of both companies to expand into the American market and deter investors. The crackdown on Chinese tech giant has implications for India. Trump's re-emergence has galvanized conservative elements in America. There is growing clamor for more stringent measures against Beijing's safety of exporting overcapacity, which has impacted local industries. To deal with China, which has accumulated a trade surplus nearing $1 trillion, an international coalition of nations may be needed to create manufacturing capacity collectively. The proposed tariffs of the incoming Trump administration may hit China in those sectors where its overcapacity has an adverse impact on local manufacturing. Alternatively, there is an anticipation in Washington for greater investment, political and financial capital for building international supply chains referenced to keep China out. These prospects open new economic opportunities for India, which is emerging as a close partner of the US. New Delhi will have to keep a close watch on global debates on economic security and impetus building to restructure the world's trading system. Drowning in content, media scope. Slow Horses is set in a slough house, home to all the rejects from MI5. In a Trumpian world, the shift of power from West to China will need to play out before the world can agree to new rules of behavior. As Donald Trump assumes office again as US President, the world has caught amidst seminal change. Since World War II, even the most powerful countries were willing to limit national sovereignty in that they agreed for most part to abide by global rules and cooperative action. Such rules were framed by a wide range of subjects, not just trade and tariffs, but also nuclear weapons, law of seas, and sanctity of national borders. This has changed for two reasons. The first is rise of China and the accompanying shift of the global power. China is not a status quo power, so it wants to shake things up and challenge the US. The second is rise of strongmen as rulers in the great power countries Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Donald Trump. These two developments have revived something that has more or less died out after World War II, namely wars of choice by great powers aimed at territorial conquest. The US war on Iraq served advance notice of what was to come. 3 years ago, Putin invaded Ukraine. Xi seems to be preparing for a Chinese assault on Taiwan, and Trump now threatens the use of force to acquire the Panama Canal and Greenland. This has been accompanied by other changes: a preference for unilateral action over multilateralism, a diminished role and utility for the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and for action to meet the climate change targets. Geopolitics was always about power, but increasingly it is power unrestrained by rules. That's true in the South China Sea, the genocide in Gaza, construction of huge new dam upstream of the Brahmaputra in Tibet, and economic sanctions that affect non-combatant third countries. Underlying these is a change in mindset from seeing interdependence and trade networks as an advantage to viewing them as vulnerability. So we see this movement away from more than half a century of trade liberalization out. They're out therefore with globalization with my country first, out with networked economy with self-reliance, out with market efficiency, in with national security. This approach didn't work well at the last time it was tried a century ago, but the lessons of history don't seem to hold much sway. Perhaps the important change is that the country that originated much of the rule making of the past, United States, is now most unreliable country on earth. Financial Times columnist asked the other day whether America had become a rogue state. No one knows what it will do next, at least of all allies. All of this makes the world a most turbulent place with many more uncertainty and risk than before. Laws and agreements reflect pre-existing power structures and the cooperative agendas that were hammered out since World War I were made possible by preeminence of the world Western paradigm and put in place by most powerful country to emerge from the war. If that world order, so to speak, is now breaking down, we have to go back to the root cause, the threat posed by the West by the rise of China at a speed and on a scale without precedent. The Western response, fueled by the perception that China has not played b- by accepted trade rules, systematically worked to deindustrialize to the West and stolen Western technologies, has been trade sanctions. These may have come too late in the day. China's industrial preeminence will remain unchallenged. Last year, it produced 12.6 times as much steel as US, 22 times as much cement, and 3 times as many cars, with whose electric models it now threatens to overwhelm the Japanese and German car markets. China's shipyards also accounted for over half the ship output. By 2030, China's manufacturing sector is projected to be bigger than that of entire Western world. It is already far and away the global leader in every sunrise industry. These strengths are useful only if China can continue to access world markets which are progressively sought to be denied. Yet China enjoyed a record trade surplus in 2024, approaching $1 trillion. In several years, it is now ahead on the West on technology. To be sure, the Chinese economy faces serious structural problems that could undermine its continued rise. But one could argue that it is dealing with them at least as successfully as Western countries with structural problems like the UK, Germany, or even the US. The reality to be dealt with is more the West feels threatened, the quicker it has abandoned whatever rules it once played by. In the new world, it is every country for itself, and might is right. Indeed, every country's defense budget is being raised, and one must hope that does not spur wider conflict. Even if such is avoided, the old world isn't coming back, and the new world can the new world agree to new rules? As these things go, the shift of global power will have to play out before countries agree to talk. After the great powers test the limits of what they can achieve through aggression or aggressive posturing, that is when the new modus vivendi might be thrashed out. One assumes that China will manage to push the US back in the Western Pacific, but not push it out altogether, and Russia will get what it seeks, a near abroad as its zone of influence. Whether this will be a stable arrangement depends on the answers to key questions: who will come in place of today's rulers, and can the great powers agree to live and let live, and what role will the middle powers play? Reform of today's global institutions will have to be addressed. Like that of the Security Council, ideally the Council should abolish the veto and adopt weighted voting that prevails in the European Union and in the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. This should make today's veto countries more responsive to international opinion and reflect the global power reality. In trade, plurilateral arrangements are more likely than fully global trading rules. New global compact on how to help African countries, home to most of the world's poorest, will be essential. None of this will be easy or the outcomes certain. Perhaps the Middle Powers could take a leaf from Qatar's book and play a mediating role to make things happen. Policy adventurism must be avoided. The decline in the consumer price index based inflation rate for December is unlikely to bring much relief to India's economic managers given the growing policy complications in recent months. The data released on Monday showed that inflation rate reached to a 4-month low of 5.22% compared to 5.48% in November. Even a standalone number decline is not comforting enough to conclude that RBI monetary policy will be in position to start reducing the policy interest rate in February meeting. A lot will depend on the projection for next year. According to the latest projections, MPC expects the inflation rate to average 4.6% in the first quarter of the next financial year, declining to 4% in second quarter. Given the fact that higher food prices are largely driving inflation outcomes, the risk to projections are high. However, other economic stakeholders may not be willing to give much time to the MPC and RBI to watch the actual inflation outcomes over the few months. The rate of growth in gross domestic product slowed to 5.4% in the second quarter this financial year. The first advanced estimate of the Statistics Department showed that the economy would expand by 6.4% in 2024-25, the lowest growth since the contraction of pandemic year. The Indian economy expanded 8.2% in 23-24. Therefore, it is being argued that policy interest rate must be lowered to support growth. However, again, policy choice will not be straightforward. The rupee is under pressure and will have implications for inflation and growth outcomes. Despite the active intervention of a central bank, the rupee has fallen over 1% thus far in 2025 against the US dollar. However, the immediate underlying reason is not particularly India specific. Nonetheless, since India runs a current account deficit and needs savings from the rest of the world to bridge the gap, large capital outflows can complicate things. What is happening in recent months is foreign money is moving out because of changed expectations in the United States. The US Federal Reserve is now expected to go slow on rate cuts. The outlook may change further depending on the timing and extent of the incoming Trump's administration policy changes. Mr. Trump has promised to increase tariffs on US import. For example, if implemented, it would push up the inflation rate in the US and change the monetary policy choices. In such conditions, more money will flow to the US because of higher bond yields. Consequently, currencies like the rupee will be under pressure. Although rupee is overvalued in real terms and needs to depreciate to protect India's external competitiveness, the nominal decline will make imports expensive and affect inflation outcomes. The inflation projection of the MPC will need to factor in such possibilities, which will not be easy given the level of uncertainty. A policy rate cut at this stage theoretically will further reduce the yield difference between Indian and US bonds and make Indian debt unattractive to foreign investors. Further complicating the picture, new sanctions on Russia have pushed up global crude oil prices, which will affect inflation outcomes to the extent as it is passed on. Thus, overall policy complications have increased significantly. Since the global environment is extremely uncertain, it would be advisable for the government to focus on growth without undermining fiscal goals. Ground realities. Groundwater contamination poses serious hazards. India's reliance on groundwater as primary source of drinking water and irrigation has grown exponentially over the years, with around 85% of rural water supply and 62% of the country's irrigation needs met by the groundwater. Its importance cannot be overstated. However, the annual Groundwater Quality Report 2024 released recently by the Central Groundwater Board highlights alarming levels of contamination in groundwater across the country. Central Groundwater Quality Report. Not only groundwater has been undervalued and overexploited, but its quality too has been neglected. The findings of the report suggest that almost 20% of the samples exceeded the permissible limit for nitrate, while 9.4% has fluoride levels above the limit. Arsenic contamination was found in 3.55% of the samples, notably in Ganga Brahmaputra plains. Groundwater contamination is often the result of combination of natural and anthropogenic factors including natural leaching of minerals, industrial discharge, unregulated mining and excessive use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Increased salinity and presence of microplastics too are the problems. In urban areas, the challenges are compounded by untreated sewage and industrial effluent seeping into aquifers. Previously, studies have shown that large share of urban groundwater samples has significant microbial contamination due to improper waste management. Poor groundwater quality has far-reaching consequences for public health. The impact on agriculture is equally concerning. Contaminated groundwater not only reduces crop yields and render water unsuitable for irrigation, but also introduces harmful substances into the food chain. Farmers in coastal regions, for instance, have reported reduced positivity due to salinity issues in groundwater driven by over-extraction and seawater intrusion. In this regard, improved agricultural water management can mitigate contamination. Adopting sustainable agricultural practices, promoting low-cost water filtration techniques for poor households, providing for proper sewage disposal and artificially recharging aquifers can improve groundwater levels and quality. Moreover, regional variations in contamination underscore the need for targeted intervention and localized groundwater management. Central government schemes like Atal Bhujal Yojana and state-level initiatives like Tamil Nadu's rainwater harvesting mandate in all buildings or arsenic mitigation programs in West Bengal are clearly not enough. It is essential to enable last mile participants, including local institutions and community members, to take charge of decisions related to groundwater management. Establishing hydrogeological monitoring networks and forming water security plans at panchayat levels can help incorporate indigenous knowledge in tackling aquifer depletion. Launching public awareness initiatives and formalizing rights to groundwater may be beneficial, Well-defined and enforceable groundwater rights detached from land ownership can offer solutions in this regard. South Asian dose of perception. The government could offer the market relief. India needs a specialized cadre for truly effective AI governance. We should all look forward to a 90-hour work month. The case for GST simplification in India is clear. It is time to act.